Welcome, everyone. I wish you a good afternoon if you're in my time zone, and good evening to my friends in Europe. So delighted to be here again at the Oxford Interfaith Forum, and so grateful to Dr. Thea and Beth for bringing us together and organizing this session. It's my pleasure to introduce you to today's guest and speaker, dear colleague, Dr. Rita George-Tvrtković, who is a professor of theology at Benedictine University in Metro Chicago, where she specializes in medieval Christian-Muslim relations and contemporary interreligious dialogue. Her books include A Christian Pilgrim in Medieval Iraq, Riccoldo da Montecroce's Encounter, forgive me if I mispronounce his name, Encounter with Islam, Nicholas of Cusa and Islam, Polemic and Dialogue in the Late Middle Ages, which she co-edited, and Christians, Muslims, and Mary, A History. She was appointed by Pope Francis to be a consultor for the Vatican's Dicastery for the Interreligious Dialogue. And of course, on this occasion, we express our condolences and sympathies to our Roman Catholic friends and the community who is mourning the passing of Pope Francis, who has left a deep legacy in Catholic Muslim dialogue. So it's only appropriate to remember him. And I welcome again Dr. Rita George-Tvrtković and invite her to the floor.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Europe. Good afternoon, North America. If we have any Asians, good night, but I'm not sure about that. It's a pleasure to be with you all today and share some of my work and research on the topic of Mary in the history of Christian-Muslim relations. I'm a Catholic historical theologian interested in the development of Christian doctrine on Islam over time. And so my starting point for the history of Mary in this is the Second Vatican Council. So I, at this time, will share my screen. So let's start. So here's the starting point for Catholics at the Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 1965. And actually, the line that inspired my book was this line in the center that is underlined. So obviously, Nostra Aetate 3 focuses on commonalities between Christians and Muslims in doctrine of God, and eschatology, and practice. But there's this line in the middle that Muslims, also honor Mary, his Virgin Mother. At times, they even call on her with devotion. And so this line got me to think about what did the history of Christian and Muslim devotion to Mary look like. So that got me going on this project and the theology, which has had its ups and downs. And Mary, in my view, has been both a bridge and a barrier in Christian-Muslim relations. So I'm going to take you along on a journey to take a look at that up and down relationship. So obviously, a starting point is biblical, and I'm not going to get into the biblical story of the Annunciation, except to highlight the fact that, of course, there's one Annunciation story in the Gospel of Luke for Christians, but of course in the Quran there are two Annunciation stories, one in Surah 3, Ali Imran, and Surah 19, Maryam. So there are two of them, and so that is actually a fruitful place. I often encourage my dialogue groups to begin with scripture on Mary and the Annunciation. But I'm going to fast forward this because we're not going to really spend time on the story. Where I'd like to start is actually with the Akathistos hymn in the 5th century. Because in the Latin West, we often think about Mary as meek and mild. But if you go to the 5th century and this hymn, I've just given you little excerpts, we see Mary as a warrior and a protector of Constantinople against pagans, the Avars, the Russians, the Arabs who stood at its gates. And so that is an important theme in especially Mary as a barrier between Christians and Muslims, because Christians have often put her on battle standards in their fights against Muslims. And so we have this early hymn as sort of the beginning of some of that language of Mary as a warrior. So the next thing I'd like to highlight is sort of the medieval Iberian Cantigas de Santa Maria, which sort of picks up on this Byzantine idea of Mary as a protector. And so you can see in this 13th century book of cantigas, of songs, about the miracles of Mary, you can see in this image very clearly, Mary is up there in the clouds, putting out her mantle as a defense of Constantinople against, in this case, the Arabs. And of course, what's interesting is that you see that the Sultan happens to look up and he also sees her in a vision. And then in this cantiga later, you see him actually converting. So this is an important theme that reemerges in the medieval period. This idea that Mary is both a barrier, so she's putting her mantle down to protect the city, but she's also a bridge, of course, a bridge to conversion. So we're going to see that in several of these cantigas that I'm sharing with you. So I do want to mention also, though, that basically in the early period, we have two stances towards Mary by Christians. And the Byzantine stance is definitely Mary as a barrier. But we see actually with Arabophone Christians, such as Nonus of Nisibis, we actually see Mary as more of a bridge because, of course, these Christians are living among Muslims as their neighbors and friends and are ruled over by Muslims. And so they have a different view and seeing her as a positive bridge. And so here's Nonus saying Muslims are pagans, but they're much more right-minded because they confess Jesus was born of a virgin and she was chaste. So we can see these qualities of Mary emerging as bridge qualities between Christians and Muslims, at least for this Arabophone Christian. So back to the cantigas and the Latin West. And so I want to tell you about Cantiga 46. So as you can see, the cantigas are set up with a panel of 6 images. The text is in Gallego, Galician, and you can see just a glimpse of the musical notes on the right side here, the music, but we will not talk about the music. We're going to talk about, I'm going to highlight 4 of these images and talk about them and how Mary is a bridge to conversion here. So I'm going to highlight these 4. Actually, the top 2 have a battle between Christians and Muslims, but on this top left one, which is the 3rd one, we see at the end of the battle, we see the division of the spoils, and we see a Muslim taking an image, an icon of Mary and Jesus. In the next panel, in the 4th panel, we see him putting the icon of Mary and Jesus in his sort of vaguely Islamic home, where he has a little altar. And basically the text here is saying something like this, that the Muslim prayed that he would understand the incarnation and please God, show him a miracle so that he could understand the incarnation. So if you go down to the bottom left, you can see that the Muslim is now kneeling before the image. And if you can look very, very carefully, you can see that the icon has sprouted breasts and has begun to lactate. So you can kind of see the thin streams of milk flowing from the icon. Very, very hard to see, but it's there. And so he kneels before the icon. You can also see how his wife and his child to the left are also breastfeeding at the same time as the icon is lactating. So Mary is indeed, at least according to the Iberian authors of the Cantigas, is certainly a bridge. But again, to what? We can see in the final panel, the Moor is being baptized. So a bridge to conversion here. Now, most of the cantigas have that bridge to conversion idea. However, one of the cantigas that I find interesting and that does not talk about Mary as a bridge to conversion is Cantiga 183, the Moors of Faro throwing Mary into the sea. And so this story talks about the village of Faro, which is on, in Portugal on the southern coast. And they talk about in former times, the statue of Mary stood on the ramparts protecting the town. But then when Muslims took over the town, the Muslims threw the statue into the sea, either to protest what they saw as Christian idolatry, or perhaps because she had some kind of a power that they wanted to get rid of. So you can see in the image on the top right, the Muslims are throwing her in. You can just see her skirts sticking up. The next panel talks about the people go out to put out their nets to fish, but surprise, surprise, no fish. So then the Muslims and the Christians go back, pull her back out of the sea, put her back on the ramparts, and oh good, in the final panel, fish. But the text says something like this, that the Muslims and the Christians who are neighbors both look to Mary. It doesn't use the language of patron saint, but it's kind of like they look to her as this common protector of the city, which I think is quite fascinating in the whole book of Cantigas, where most of the time Mary is a bridge to conversion. Here she seems to be a bridge to friendship, neighborliness, dialogue maybe, which we really don't see that much of in the history, at least in the Latin West, until we get to the modern period. So those are the Cantigas, which are beautiful and fascinating for this commentary on Mary. I want to show you a few other cases of medievals who are highlighting Mary as some kind of a bridge. So the first one is William of Tripoli, who's a Dominican writing from the Levant in the latter part of the 13th century. And of course, he writes a polemic against Islam. And of course, he wants to convert Muslims. But there's a very interesting section in the last chapter of his Notitia de Mahometi, where he describes apparently his personal observation of Muslim devotional prayers in a mosque. And as you can see in this quote, he says, while gathered in the mosque, one of the faithful begins to read by heart the history of Mary or Joseph or Zechariah or another lively devotion. And wherever the name of Mary, Jesus, or Joseph, or Abraham, or Muhammad is mentioned, they praise God with sweet whispers and tears. In their prayer, I think they please God and men if they have true faith. Now, of course, it's qualified with if they have true faith, but it's still amazing to think, and he's amazed, and surprised and touched by their devotion to Mary and other shared figures. So I think William of Tripoli is an important person, not well known, but someone that you should know about. And also, I would say one more thing about William of Tripoli. In his book, he also includes very long verbatim quotes from the Quran about Jesus and Mary and talks about them as similarities, which is, again, quite striking for this time. All right. Let me move on to say something about Nicholas of Cusa briefly, whose Cribratio al-Qurani is a sifting of the Quran. And of course, he's also critical and polemical. However, he's famous for his Pia Interpretatio, where he tries to read the Quran sympathetically. And here is where he kind of describes that approach. Suppose we admit that the goal and intent of the book of the Quran is not only not to detract from God, but also to give glory to the God, to praise and to bear witness to Christ, the Son of Mary, above all. If so, then when one reads the Quran with this understanding, assuredly some fruit can be elicited from it. And so he goes on to talk about how the Quran's Mariology and Christology are actually bridge points between Christians and Muslims. So again, another later medieval period who highlights Mary in her role as a bridge. All right, now back to barrier. So we get to 1571, the famous Battle of Lepanto, where the Catholic League miraculously defeats the Ottoman navy, and Pope Pius V, who's a Dominican, who really promoted the rosary, attributed that victory to the rosary and to Mary. And so we have this explosion of art, paintings. Also, if you go around Rome, There's images throughout many, many churches in Rome. There were plays, there were songs, there were poems calling Mary Our Lady of Victory. And in fact, a feast day was founded soon after Our Lady of Victory, October 7th, which is the date of the battle. It was soon changed to Our Lady of the Rosary, kept the same date, and Catholics around the world still honor this day as Our Lady of Rosary. Little do they know that it's Our Lady of Victory over the Muslims. And so that's something to kind of think about, that connection between the rosary as this kind of weapon against Muslims that's still around at this time. And so we actually see other Our Ladies of Victory happening. And so this one, I go every year to Croatia, the coast, to visit my husband's family. And I found out about Our Lady of Sin, which is very close to Split. And every August, they have a novena, 9 days before Assumption on August 15th, where they celebrate this victory, August 15th, 1750, again, of the Croatian underdogs against their against the Ottomans. And it's the same thing. It's the idea that she's Our Lady of Victory. In fact, this image that I show you began like this in Bosnia. And when people left Bosnia for Croatia, they had this image, but then they added this beautiful crown after the victory. So they literally crowned her the Our Lady of Victory. So these are all over the place. And in fact, in the doors of the cathedral to this day, you can see there's a battle on the cathedral doors there, and then you can see Mary floating above, very similar to the Cantigas image of Mary. All right, checking on my time. Okay, good. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about another interesting phenomenon in the medieval period, later medieval period, about Muhammad and Islamic text in early modern Christian pro-immaculatist art. And what I mean by that is, of course, at this time, we have an intra-Catholic debate about Mary and her Immaculate Conception. Famously, the Dominicans were against it, so actually kind of surprising, right? And the Franciscans and the Jesuits were for it. And so we have many pieces of art that will have, the Immaculate Conception of Mary, and then you'll have figures, Catholic figures, kind of on both sides of the aisle debating it. So the image I'm going to show you, and I want to give you a content warning for any Muslim audience members, just to know that what you'll be seeing in a second is a Christian originating image of Muhammad. It's not derogatory. It's quite complimentary, but it will appear in the following 2 slides. So I just want to highlight that to my Muslim friends who are here, if there are any. Any case, in this image, which is also in Croatia, and it's still on the walls of a church in Split across the street from the soccer stadium. Okay, so you can go and see it yourself. So in this image, we have all of the Catholic doctors with their little scrolls where they're explaining their arguments, their pro-immaculate arguments in this image. But what's so fascinating about it is that you will see on the bottom right, among the Catholic doctors who are pro-Immaculate Conception is Muhammad himself. So I'm going to show you the image here. And so actually you can read a little bit about this image in John Toland's book, Faces of Muhammad, but he doesn't actually have the image. This is an image from Ivana Chapeta-Rakic, who's a art historian at the University of Split. And so she actually told me about this image. It's her image. In any case, you can see there's Mary at top. You can see all the scholars with Catholic scholars, all of them, except on the bottom right is Muhammad. And what is he pointing to? Well, I will show you a close-up of that one. Oh, and by the way, the gentleman on the bottom left is also a Muslim astronomer, I believe, who the scholar Ivana Chapeta-Rakic talks about. But anyway, we're going to talk about Muhammad. So here's Muhammad. And actually, it says that, no one who comes from Adam has been, everyone has been from Adam, sons of Adam have been touched by Satan, except for Mary and her son. Now, it's wrongly attributed to the Quran. It's actually from the Hadith of al-Bukhari. But in any case, it's quite fascinating to think about the painter of this image was including Muhammad in an intra-Catholic debate about the Immaculate Conception of Mary. So it's something to kind of keep in mind of Mary as a bridge there, certainly. All right, next up, we have an image from Mughal India. And this image, you can go see it in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It is from the Mirat al-Quds, the Mirror of Holiness, which was written by Jerome Xavier, who was the grandnephew of Saint Francis Xavier, and he was a part of the Jesuit mission to the Mughals. And this book, The Mirror of Holiness, was a life of Christ, the first life of Christ, commissioned by the Emperor Akbar, which is astounding and astonishing. And it was originally written in Persian and then translated into Latin. But why this picture is kind of a bridge is because the image was created by Muslim artists in Akbar's hybrid art studio, probably Muslim and also Hindu artists. But it is a very Muslim interpretation of the Nativity. You know, if you're a Christian familiar with the Nativity, you wouldn't look at this and think, oh, yes, that's the Nativity scene. But here she is, Mary, pregnant, nesting, she's kind of cleaning up the birthing area in the image. But this is a lovely example of Mary as a bridge because at this time, images of Mary were very popular. They were bought up by Muslims. And again, the Jesuits were hoping that Our Lady of Beauty here would be a bridge, of course, to conversion. But it's maybe an image we don't think of. And I would like to add that they weren't simply images of Mary, but they were also these traditional Islamic hilya descriptions of holy people describing the physical qualities. This was done with Muhammad and others. So here we can see there's a description of her olive complexion, her middle height, her eyes were large, her hair was golden, her hands and fingers were long and well-formed, well-proportioned, right? So her inner virtue is matched by her outer perfection, if you will. All right. So now I'm going to fast forward to the contemporary period. Again, back to the Vatican II Nostra Aetate Part 3 and talking about Catholics talking about Muslim devotion to Mary, even though I'm sure Dr. Zainab will talk to us a little bit about, devotion to Mary among Muslims, which is contested. Should you do it? Should you not? And there's disagreement, but the truth is there are Muslims who are devoted and do go to these shared shrines. So I'm just going to share a few of them with you. One of the most important and popular is Meryem Ana Evi in Turkey, in Ephesus, or near Ephesus of all places, because of course Ephesus was the place where the Theotokos at the Council of Ephesus, right, Mary as God-bearer, which of course Muslims would not agree with that, and yet here's the place where Christians and Muslims meet at this shrine. And you can see in these pictures, there's a room that's more Christian with a statue of Mary, and then there's another room that just has Quranic verses. Several popes visited, including John Paul II, and then you see outside this prayer wall where people tie prayers to the wall, and it's a very popular place. I'd also like to add that when the Council Fathers were debating Nostra Aetate 3 in 1964, so a full year before the document came out, there were 3 Council Fathers who specifically wanted to add the line about Marian devotion, because before we have the text of Nostra Aetate 3 today, it was very short, just like Christians and Muslims believe in one God. And so these Council Fathers wanted to add Marian devotion, and all 3 of them mentioned this site in Turkey in particular, which was promoted by Louis Massignon and also by Joseph Descuffi, who is a Vincentian bishop in Turkey in this place. So this location is very important actually for Nostra Aetate, because after the Council Fathers made their intervention, the line about devotion was entered into the text. So I'm going to just show you a few other places in the world with Mary as a bridge to dialogue and friendship. So we see this shift in the 20th century, but even in the late 19th century. So to highlight Our Lady of Africa in Algiers, you can see on the apse, it says, Notre Dame d'Afrique, priez pour nous et pour les musulmans. And, pray for us and for the Muslims. And I was thinking, well, maybe this was a modern edition, but I found a photo from 1899 where it says the same thing, pray for us and for the Muslims. And so the White Fathers who were involved in this, this parish, and also involved in interreligious dialogue, and also involved in writing Nostra Aetate, are a part of this sort of ethos of dialogue. And in fact, at this cathedral, we have mostly Muslims coming, but 90% at least of the pilgrims coming here are Muslims coming to this Marian shrine. Many women who specifically want to become pregnant. So this is a very, very popular place in Algeria. And then we have Mariamabad in Pakistan, where we have not only Christians and Muslims pilgrimaging here, but also Sikhs and Hindus. So it's really a multi-religious shrine. We have Our Lady of Saidnaya in Syria, built in the 6th century. And amazingly, it has withstood the troubles there. And recently, when they were talking about the Saidnaya prison, I guess is nearby, all I could think of was, oh no, the name of Saidnaya is being besmirched by the prison. But this shrine is a very ancient, common pilgrimage site. In fact, we have medieval images, and here we have medieval Christians visiting the Our Lady of Saidnaya's shrine, and you can see the image is oozing an oil that's dripping into the basin. And so Christians, Muslims, and Jews, we have medieval accounts saying Christians, Muslims, and Jews went here specifically for the healing oil that was emerging from this icon. Okay. All right. And then another one is Our Lady of Lebanon, Harissa. And, this is an important shrine. And Lebanon is just important for Christian-Muslim relations because a few years ago, a Sunni Muslim wanted to highlight Christian and Muslim positive relations. And so he suggested to the government that they create a national holiday on March 25th, the Annunciation Day. There's no Catholic nation that I know of that has a national holiday on the Annunciation. It's only in Lebanon. And someone correct me if I'm wrong. Someone find a country that has the feast day of the Annunciation as a national holiday. I don't think there is one. Only Lebanon, and this at the prompting of a Muslim. So that's definitely a place where Mary is a bridge to dialogue and friendship. And really, I'd like to highlight Louis Massignon, of course, as someone who really jump-started this idea of Mary as a bridge to dialogue and friendship, rather than a bridge to conversion, which still in the 1950s was being preached. For example, Bishop Fulton Sheen, who is an American bishop who was really like the TV and radio evangelist of the time. Okay, he was a very popular personality, Bishop Sheen. He wrote a book about Mary, and there's a whole chapter about Mary and the Muslims, the old-fashioned spelling, where he says, hey, I've heard from missionaries that she is great as a bridge to conversion. So Bishop Sheen is writing in the 50s. At the same time, Louis Massignon is coining the term Abrahamic faiths. He's a professor to some of the framers of Nostra Aetate 3, like Anawati and Kaspar. And so the 50s is really this time. Also, Pope Pius XII, who was, had the Marian decade of the 50s, and by the way, used Mary as a barrier to the latest round of pagans, who were the communists, of course. But Pius XII also talked about Mary as both a bridge to conversion and dialogue and friendship. So we can really see the turn here as we move to Vatican II. All right, so back to Vatican II. Again, here's the full text with Mary sort of right in the middle as not only a shared figure of doctrine in terms of her virginity and motherhood of Jesus, but also she's also this bridge figure in terms of devotion. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that, Zainab, in terms of that being a controversial idea for Muslims. But, that's also a controversial idea for Christians, of course. That's an intra-Christian argument, right? Because Protestants would say, no, thank you. We don't do that in general. And, you know, it's an intra-Muslim discussion where many of my students, and by the way, at my university, it's a Catholic university, but we have about 25% Muslim student body. And so I always have these great dialogues with my students, and a lot of them say, no, 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 we don't do that. We're not allowed to have any mediators, right? Me and God, direct. But then the South Asian Muslims will say, but yes, you know, we go to dargahs, and, you know, so the Muslims, we have a discussion with them about the intra-Muslim diversity there. So I'd like to hear more, Dr. Zainab, about that. So there's sort of the standard for Catholic theology today. And I just want to end with a few things. First of all, with the cardinal, actually, he's cardinal who recently passed away. He was the president of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. And a few years ago in Lebanon, and I love his idea of Mary as a model for dialogue. And by the way, a model for Christians and Muslims, men and women, because I think sometimes we think Mary is only a model for women. No, she is a model for all of us, for men and women, anyone who wants to be in dialogue, right? Because the Annunciation is sort of this perfect dialogue, right? She's not closed up in certainties. She asks questions. She has courage. She lets the angel in. You know, angels are scary beings, and yet she has the courage to ask questions and let the angel in, to remain open and available to others. So I think that's a lovely way to think about Mary as a model for dialogue. The last thing I want to talk about is, and actually just recently wrote an article about this, is sort of like are Muslims innovating new ways of devotion to Mary? Because, you know, we can talk about the shared shrines, and that's old ways, I guess you could say. But this is a picture of a billboard near me, near O'Hare Airport. And I was not driving when I took the picture. But it's a billboard that the Muslim group ICNA put up. And if you can see it, it says, "Respect, honor, strength, hijab, a head covering honored by Mary, mother of Jesus, and worn by Muslim women." And I think this is sort of a modern day example of Mary as a bridge to dialogue and friendship between Christians and Muslims. So Muslims themselves are realizing that she can be a bridge to dialogue and friendship, particularly Muslims who are a minority in the United States of America, and they need to build these bridges. And so they're reaching out with this. I would say there's other examples of bridges too, like there are mosques around the world that Muslims are very specifically naming after Maryam and saying it's because we want to highlight good interfaith relations, including a mosque in Abu Dhabi that I think had a different name, and they specifically changed the name to Maryam. So I think Muslims are embracing her as well as a bridge to dialogue and friendship. So that's what I have for you, and I would welcome very much conversation and a dialogue right now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rita. What a rich and wonderful presentation. I've learned a lot just from your walkthrough. So all these interesting examples, and was really, moved to see all these wonderful, imageries and the examples you've collected. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful for your scholarship and your insights and your wisdom you've shared with us. The example you've given, Dr. Rita, about how Mary was used as actually Prophet Muhammad and the Islamic tradition was used for, supporting intra-Christian debates and arguments. I was really fascinated by that, specifically about how Prophet Muhammad, and as you rightly pointed out, how one of the narrations that Jesus and Mary were not touched by Satan were used to support the Immaculate Conception. I wonder, are there any more examples of that? How Islamic resources, Muslim texts have been used in support of certain intra-Christian, conversations and debates? I will be really curious to hear more about that. The intra-Muslim devotion and a little bit the mixed reactions towards devotion towards Maryam within the Muslim community. I think you really make the fair point that there are Muslims who will say, well, for us, there is absolute concern to preserve the radical oneness of God and the radical monotheism of God. And we don't want to compromise on that. So we don't want to, go too much into the extreme of, devotion of Mary, because then we see her, she could be viewed as an intermediary. So you would definitely see that within Muslim practice and devotion, that you have few Muslims or some Muslims who would say, well, we don't visit the tombs of saints and the graveyards. So there are definitely mixed responses in that regard. And that's there, that kind of diversity within, towards Mary exists within the Islamic community. I think fundamentally what is at stake here is a concern to not go into extremes. Within the Islamic tradition, of course, just for the guests and our audiences, a strong encouragement to go and visit the graveyards and offer your prayer and respect for especially pious people and those saintly figures. But then, of course, that has to be in moderation. And once things get a little bit, into the extreme, that's when then a few Muslims would react, and that's why we don't do it at all. So absolutely, I think it's fair to point that out, that there's a mixed reaction towards, devotion of Mary. I'll stop here. I have a few other notes, but I want to give you a chance to respond.
Thank you so much. Yeah, first of all, in terms of later medieval, early modern figures using Mary, the Muslim Mary or Muhammad, to support their Christian or intra-Catholic debates, I think using Muhammad to support the Catholic view of the Immaculate Conception is rather unique. However, it was quite common for both Catholics and Protestants to use Muslims more generally in their arguments against each other. So for example, we have Guillaume Postel, who was, by the way, the first professor of Arabic at the Collège de France, wrote a book against the Protestants, the Evangelistas, okay? And one of the lines, and this actually is also one of the inspirations for my book, one of the lines where he says, where Muslims and Protestants are similar, is that he says, neither Muslims nor Protestants honor Mary as they should. So again, he's using Muslims to actually argue against Protestants. There's another example. If any of you read Martin Luther's introduction to Bibliander's Quran in the 1550s, I think he did the intro in the 1550s, not the first Bibliander version, but the second one, I believe. And in that, he basically says, and in other books, Luther says, well, Muslims are bad for their ceremonies and their rituals, but of course, Catholics are worse. So we see this as a very common trope that Christians and the Catholics and Protestants are using Muslims against each other. So again, that's why I say the Immaculate Conception idea is very unique in the sense that Muhammad is seen as this sage, right? Well, he's right about Mary, so he can't be that bad. I think that's unusual. But yeah, Muslims are a foil. Yes. Okay. Your second comment about is intra-Muslim debates about whether or not it's appropriate to have devotion, right? And so, you mentioned ziyarah, right? The idea of visiting tombs. And of course, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote against ziyarah in the medieval period, which of course, when you write against something, it means it's happening. And so Muslims have always visited tombs. In fact, that's why the Wahhabis got rid of all the tombs in the Arabian Peninsula, precisely because people were going there and were like, stop doing that. So of course, among certain Arab cultures, you have this sense of, no, don't do ziyarah. But then other places, sub-Saharan African Muslims and South Asian Muslims, Indonesian Muslims, have this rich, pilgrimage tradition to these minor places. And also you had this concept of tawassul, right? Of intercession that has Quranic, this idea of seek the ways to God, right? And so some Muslims use that as an argument for intercession. There's a great book by Hans Harmaputra. He's an Indonesian Protestant theologian, and it's about Christians and Muslims on the idea of the saints and the communion of saints. Anyway, I recommend that book because he really gets into the question of, is it allowed or not? And yeah, I think Muslims are still talking about it.
Yeah, I think those also relate to the questions of orthodoxy, orthopraxis, heterodoxy. I think trying to check check the balances. What are the boundaries and borders? And I think that's across any religious community. When you look at the Sufi tradition, which has a great emphasis in Islam on the heart and the aesthetics, and especially more on those devotional practices, you see that very much uplifted. But then, of course, you mentioned Wahhabi Islam, the more literal and more kind of, how do I phrase it, more literal approach to trying to preserve orthodoxy in a sense, like saying, oh, here's a border, we can't use Mary as an intermediary. I mean, I think they are both needed, like trying to keep each other in check, because the heart and the head go together. And so there is that element certainly at play. We have a question from our audience, and you mentioned actually Indonesia, so that's here on point, the question. Is there anything known about Mary in prayer of Christians and Muslims in Indonesia?
Yeah, I mean, I have not studied that myself, but again, I would refer you to Hans Harmaputra's book, because as an Indonesian Protestant scholar, I'm sure he probably talks about them. I just haven't studied that myself.
Rita, you mentioned new ways of highlighting Mary as a bridge builder. And I like that billboard. That's certainly an example, right? Like often you think, okay, why is Mary, who is covered or wearing a scarf, seen as pious and devout, but a Muslim woman who decides to wear the scarf seen as backward and oppressed? So trying to use her to counter Islamophobic attitudes, right? And saying, modesty and religious garbs, the dress codes are prominent, not just within the Muslim tradition, but also in the Christian tradition. So trying to use her as a bridge builder. And certainly, I love that you highlighted the contemporary landscape of mosques. I mean, we here in our backyard in Maryland, I'm in Maryland, Hail Mary, the city of Mary. And we have the Mariam Islamic Center. Yeah, we have the Mariam Mosque in Texas. So I think these are very much wonderful examples of how Muslims are trying to use her as a bridge builder and saying, hey, we have a sibling relationship with you. We emerged out of the Near Eastern context together, and trying to really connect through her with the wider, especially Christian community, I think. And so I think those examples are very much out there, and I see it more and more. And I wonder, okay, what the naming and the strategy of naming a mosque in trying to point to these shared connections. Are there any other examples of contemporary ways to highlight Mary as a bridge builder that you can think of?
Yes, I mean, one quite, again, striking, shocking could be from Muslims is a good friend and colleague of mine, Amir Hussein, who's a professor of Islamic studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And he told me a few years ago that he met the Franciscan icon writer, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but a Franciscan icon writer. And this professor, Amir Hussein, commissioned an icon of Our Lady of the Quran. Okay, so a Muslim is commissioning from a Catholic icon writer an icon of Mary, Our Lady of the Quran, which is like, some Muslims would definitely take issue with that. There's a great book by Klaus von Stosch and Muna Tatari. I highly encourage all of you to know that book, Mary in the Quran, and it's a joint, comparative theologians writing together, a Christian and Muslim writing about Mary. Anyway, in their book they said there's no Our Lady in Islam. There's no Our Lady. no, don't do it. They say don't do it. And yet here's a Muslim in the US who's saying, yeah, I'm going to do it. Yeah, so I think that's a great example of a certain Muslim scholar who's going in his own way as an homage to her, as a bridge to dialogue and friendship, which actually maybe among his fellow Muslims might burn a few bridges. I don't know. So I think Mary's so interesting, right? Because in some ways she's more divisive intra-religiously, both for Christians and for Muslims, right? And better at being a bridge between religions. So I think that's a great example. And then another example are, again, my students. So again, we have many Muslim women students who organized on their own accord. They wanted to do an event inspired by our readings of Mary on modesty in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And so they invited a female Jewish scholar, a female Muslim scholar, and then me and the students to talk about what is modesty. And they were especially excited to learn about, Orthodox Jewish women who cover their hair and dress modestly. And so they saw that interesting Jewish-Muslim connection. And that was all student instigated. So I love it, of course, when students take the torch.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Beth had a question for you. Beth, please.
Oh, yes. And it could be a question for both of you. Thank you for your wonderful talk, Rita, and I'm so enjoying the conversation and the dialogue that's emerging here. Connecting you both, but also connecting to our last talk, Francesca talked about a sort of habitus of listening. And I really think of Mary as this sort of model of listening and obedience. And I'm thinking about Zeynep's talk about the virtues that Mary espouses. I was wondering, from both of your perspectives, of which of those virtues do you think, and for different communities and sort of social habitus settings, where might we find, I suppose, virtues that would be a barrier or would be a bridge? And that could be from different sort of social perspectives, or maybe as you were moving into this discussion about contemporary Mary. Does that make sense? I was sort of thinking a lot about her as a listening figure, and that was really pulling on the dialogue we had last time as well, because that can be both a sort of a very good virtue, but I guess she also acts on the listening, and it's not a passive listening, those kind of things.
Yeah, I love the question, and I've thought about it quite a lot too, because in what sense, towards the end of my book, of course, I talk about how is Mary a bridge for those Christians who don't accept her, not even counting Protestants, but also for those Catholics who reject exactly what you say, the sort of submissive, Mary who's obedient in a negative sense. And and I like to think about two images of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Of course, the traditional one is she's definitely that submissive, quiet Mary. But there's a beautiful image. I'm sorry, I don't have it with me to show you all, but please look up Yolanda Lopez, who's a Mexican artist who has this gorgeous Our Lady of Guadalupe, who is like vibrant, and she's literally a runner, Mary. Like, she's wearing running shoes. Okay, she has strong legs, she's powerful, vibrant. And so that's a Mary, right? That maybe, that women can embrace that. And the qualities, right? The qualities for me are her courage, again, that she takes in the angel. And of course, even in the Quranic story, she's like, go away, go away, so she's courageous in accepting the angel into her space. But then she also is a questioner. She right? Because Mary in the gospel is always pondering things. She's always pondering things in her heart. So in addition to listening, that makes sense. When you really listen with the ear of your heart, as Benedict says, right? You're going to ponder it in your heart. And so therefore, the Mary in the Annunciation, she gives her consent. So that's active. I definitely don't see her as passive, but please do look up Yolanda Lopez's Guadalupe. I think you'll all enjoy that picture. I don't know if Zeynep has any thoughts.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think for me, her courage, I don't see her as this passive, submissive. She has this, it takes courage to enter, from a Quranic perspective, to enter the sacred temple and be there among all these male scholars. And God's calling her to be there, and she is going there with full confidence. And for me, as a Muslim woman, as a young Muslim girl, and I've shared that previously, I think here in my writing, she is that embodiment of courage and confidence, because so many times, especially when it comes to access to certain, the workforce or public spaces or scholarship, it takes courage and persistence, right, to be in those spaces as a woman, slash especially as a Muslim woman, I think, to find your voice, to find your place in the world. And so personally, that's how I relate to her, the courage and confidence and persistence, and that quiet strength that I've never seen her as this quite submissive figure. But also the confidence and courage and trust in God's will and decree, and lean into uncertainty, because that takes a lot of courage. Yeah. I don't know what's happening, what God's plan is, but I'm going to be courageously trusting his plan. I think a lot of times I myself would be in a position of like, why? Well, this is odd. Why am I supposed to do this? So trying to really say, be courageous, confidently trust in your Lord and your Creator, and see how there's possibility in uncertainty. And we see that unfolding in her life and in your journey. So courage, confidence, and again, her compassion. I think for me, what I always seen her is her compassion, that loving embrace. And that's how I connect to her. And I see her very much as a bridge builder. You mentioned Nostra Aetate, that was your departure point. This year is Nostra Aetate at 60th anniversary. And I think, just to conclude our session, as a Muslim girl who grew up in a majority Catholic, region in Germany, I would have loved to see the content that you presented at school, public school, right? To like see how our communities, how approached this important sacred figure as a bridge, as a barrier. And moving forward, maybe, how can this be uplifted? How can we look at our shared history of Christian-Muslim relations, and Mary in particular, and see what were moments of conflict, moments of concord, moments where we were thriving together, or where we, clashed. And I think just having these kind of opportunities amplified, where the younger generation is exposed, I think is fantastic. And I want to thank you for your work on this, and also with your students. You're really creating some important learning opportunities for them when you have Muslims and Christians engaging in the classroom and talking about how is this, let's look at this together, and how does this work, and how can we learn from this moving forward. So I want to thank you, Dr. Rita, for this amazing presentation.